Rick Lorneman slithered on his belly to the edge of the cliff. Dry grass whipped at the side of his face and he pulled the headscarf higher to protect him.
"You see it?"
he asked.
"As plain as day."
Skagran passed the telescope over and pointed.
"She's right there, taking pride of place in the center of the flotilla."
Rick Lorneman peered through the scope, careful to shade the glass at the end from the bright sun. It would not do to give away their position to the Chaos Legion's main fleet, whether they were harbored or not. He tracked the wake of a small pinnace as it sailed towards Telberg's harbor until he came upon the warship. Sure enough, there she was. The vicious Moor, the greatest and most terrible flagship that had ever sailed through Praetorian seas. Deckhands scurried across its main deck as cargo was moved down into the hold. A sailor dangled from the mizzenmast, shouting something down to his crewmen on the poop deck, who were wandering about with paintbrushes and buckets of black tar. Rick Lorneman scanned across to the forecastle and saw the white jaws appear on the black hull as the ship gently bobbed, the bow rising out of the swell to display the painted namesake in all of its glory, an image that had no doubt struck terror into the very hearts of many a sea captain in the past.
"Looks like we might be just in time."
Rick Lorneman closed the brass flap over the end of the telescope and slid it together.
"I'd wager they're preparing to set sail soon." "Then we should get down there. You thinking a night attack?"
Skagran took the scope from him and shoved it into a light pack. Rick Lorneman shook his head. "We'll go just before sunset. There'll be a lot of movement about the dockside then, and we should be able to blend in better. I want Hidana and Redis to ready their sections. They'll be coming with us. Sather can hold a rear guard near the eastern gate in case we need to get out quick. Tell her to bring the mounts down the cliff and into the tree line nearby." Skagran nodded and crawled back away from the cliff edge. Rick Lorneman spared one last glance at the warship floating in the waters off Heroes Island before following his second-in-command. The dockside was packed with Chaos Legion as Rick Lorneman casually strolled along. Wharfies fought with ropes, tying ships to their moorings or releasing them, whilst others carried cargo back and forth from the wide decks. In the distance he could see the main mast of the vicious Moor, a long pennant flapping in the cool sea breeze. A rowdy group of sailors sauntered by, swigging from bottles of rum and cursing at each other. One of them caught his shoulder, and he dramatically swayed to the edge of the quay, crouching to a low grovel.
"My apologies, sir."
Rick Lorneman slurred his words, covering his face as best he could.
"Too much rum's bandy-legged me. I can't walk straight."
The sailor gave him a cursory glance before continuing with his group, not even bothering to reply. Rick Lorneman watched as they disappeared amongst the bustle before he stood up and glanced across at the opposite pier, seeing Hidana and her men gradually making their way through the busy throngs of labourers. Skagran sidled up to him.
"So far, so good. Redis's team is in place with a few surprises in case things turn south."
"Good." Rick Lorneman smiled at a passing woman, touching the point of his triangular cloth hat that he managed to acquire from a sleeping drunk in the city's cobbled streets. He looked to the sun and shifted the pack he wore from one shoulder to the other.
"We should move while it's still busy and the light is good."
Skagran grinned and walked past him, making for a small skiff that bobbed in the harbour's gentle swell.
"I think I've just spotted our ride."
Rick Lorneman paused as his comrade climbed down a rusted ladder and jumped to the craft. He waited to see if anyone noticed or took umbrage, but the owner was clearly not present, so he quickly joined Skagran. They cast off from the pilings, taking the oars and rowing towards the entrance channel. The outer harbour was nearly as busy as the inner had been, with all manner of boats and ships, either moored or meandering their way around the organised clutter. Rick Lorneman heard a baneful screech nearby and looked up to the deck of a galleon where a cluster of soldiers fought with a chained beast that had clearly decided it was not going to do what they wanted. One of the soldiers was thrown from his feet and landed near the gunwale. peering down at them as they rowed by. Rick Lorneman quickly looked away and pointed at the tall stone harbour walls, pretending he was in conversation with his companion. When he discreetly managed to cast a glance back, the soldier had returned to help with trying to corral the incensed beast. They rowed on, and as they passed the crenellated towers that stood guard at either end of the outer harbour wall, he noticed Hidana and her troops in an impressive-looking cutter, quickly catching up with them. The seas were choppy, and the cutter quickly overtook them, its larger streamlined hull breaking through the messy swell. The sun had turned a burnt orange when they reached the flagship. Their timing was perfect, and anyone looking down at the waves would have seen only dark shadows and murky shades of shifting blue. Hidana had already moored alongside the vicious Moor when Rick Lorneman arrived. Skagran quickly tethered their own skiff, fixing it tightly to the cutter.
Wait,
Rick Lorneman whispered.
secure it alongside the Moor. We'll head back in the cutter. This can stay here.
They busied themselves pulling the boat around the hull of the cutter and attaching it to the flagship whilst Hidana scaled the imposing hull of the flagship using climbing claws. The rest of them waited patiently as she disappeared over the gunwale. It seemed like an age before she returned, and a thin rope was lowered down for the first of them to begin the climb. Rick Lorneman was the last up. He placed the heavy backpack into their skiff before he started his ascent, the contents of which were an extra piece of assurance in case the mission was compromised. Sliding silently onto the deck, he could see the rest of their group nearby, behind a jumble of crates that had been tied down with thick netting. Checking it was clear, he silently moved to join them.
Right. We need to make for the captain's cabin. That's where the plans will be.
He slid his bow from within a waxed hide and silently strung it.
If we have time, we copy the plans and leave them there. If not, we grab them and get out.
What if we get compromised? Hidana asked, without concern.
No different than normal.
Rick Lorneman smiled.
We cause as much chaos and confusion as we can and disappear. If that happens, you won't want to be left on this ship. Trust me.
They all nodded, and Rick Lorneman looked at each in turn.
This is probably our most important mission ever. Straight from old King Wilhelm himself. What we do today could seriously damage our enemy.
Nobody said anything. They all knew how important this was. The king had sent his own rangers. That meant everything. Rick Lorneman held his hand out.
Fly like the wind, cut like the claw,
he said. The others placed their hands on his and repeated the hallowed motto.
Now, we move. 2 teams, port and starboard. Keep the keels clean and quiet,
Skagran growled. There was a flurry of movement as the rangers moved out beneath the creeping shadows of the bleeding sun as it slowly sank from the heavens into a watery sea grave. Rick Lorneman crept along the portside gunwale, keeping a steady aim upon the guard that stood above them on the quarter deck. He stopped next to a large barrel and waited as Skagran climbed the steps, seeing the other team moving in unison in his periphery. The next he knew, a knife quickly flashed across the guard's neck. The guard was caught as he fell, passed back between the team until the last one pushed the body beneath a pile of sailcloth. Rick Lorneman waited for the signal and then moved up to join them. There was still a struggle on the starboard side, where 3 guards were being disposed of, but it was brief, and the bodies quickly hidden. The stern castle held even more soldiers, and sailors were climbing up the ratlines and into the rigging. If the rangers were not careful, they were going to be spotted. Rick Lorneman signaled for his team to move inside, and they made their way into the quarters. Skagran remained on point and came face to face with a mean-looking officer, a long scar running from his cheek down into the ruffled collar of his doublet. Both men froze briefly before Skagran swung his knife, and the officer opened his mouth to shout a warning. Neither of them made it. Rick Lorneman's arrow took the man in his neck and stopped him dead. There was a muffled thud as the body hit the wooden floor. The whole team waited, holding their weapons ready. But it wasn't noticed, and so after hiding the body they continued on. Rick Lorneman could hear a loud commotion from the galley below, which explained where most of the ship's skeleton crew would be, and gave him a surge of hope that they might complete their mission successfully. The door to the captain's quarters was unlocked, and the two teams came together in the darkness of the hold, filing through the doorway before closing it behind them. A large table held the center of the ornate room, with parchment and scrolls scattered across it. Rick Lorneman moved quickly, searching through the offerings while his rangers held the door and scanned for anything that might give them away. There was all sorts of information: troop movement orders, cargo manifests, and crudely drawn maps of the Shimmer archipelago. Rick Lorneman slid the parchments about the table until finally he found what he was looking for: the complete orders and formations for the next naval strike. A shiver ran down his spine. It was against his home city, Liberia, a staging battle for the naval assault against Anamun. Quickly, pulling the translucent parchment from his belt together with a stick of charcoal, he placed it on top of the commands and started to rub a copy. It was then he heard a shout.
"Intruders! In the captain's quarters! Intruders on!"
There was a crack of glass shattering. Rick Lorneman turned to see two of his rangers with empty bows, moving to look out through the aft windows. Outside those windows, a boy's body slid from a narrow rope swing, two arrows protruding from his chest. His hands still clutching a cloth and bucket.
"Would you believe it? Caught by a bloody window cleaner!"
Hidana spat, drawing two curved blades from her back and moving to the door.
We ain't got no time for that.
Skagran hurried past Rick Lorneman and waited by the door.
Just grab the whole lot.
Rick Lorneman cursed and collected up the scattered parchments, desperately shoving them inside his goatskin bag before tucking it into his leather cuirass. A ranger opened the door slightly and peered through, whispering the coast was clear. Turning back, he received a crossbow bolt through the side of his face and dropped to the floor. The others tried to close the door, but the body was in the way. Reaching down to move him, Skagran almost took a bolt himself as it flew through the gap. It glanced from the edge of his leather pauldron and smashed into a drinks cabinet, sending glass from the decanters flying everywhere as the contents spilled across the floor.
"There's no escape that way. Not if we want to keep our heads,"
Hidana snarled, finally kicking the door closed as another ranger dragged the table back against it.
We go out the window,
Rick Lorneman decided quickly.
Bryla, try and light one of these oil lamps. Let's get a nice fire going for them. That should give us a fair chance of making it back to the cutter.
Bryla nodded and rushed towards the drinks cabinet, smashing any of the decanters or bottles that were not already broken on the floor. Rick Lorneman ran to the window and kicked out the remainder of the glass, peering up at where the rope swing still hung. There was a sailor climbing down it fast, with a blade between his teeth. A loud bang sounded as the cabin door was struck by something heavy from the other side. They needed to be quick if they were going to make it. Leaning out again, Rick Lorneman aimed with his bow and shot the man from the rope. He notched another arrow and fired again. The arrowhead sliced through one loop of the rope and cut it loose. Then it ricocheted off the thick gun wall and careened into the darkening sky. The thuds against the door increased into a regular pattern, and the table shuddered under the strikes.
"Out, out, out! Into the waters and back to the boat!"
Rick Lorneman yelled above the din. Rangers moved past him, jumping onto the dangling rope and lowering themselves down to the end before dropping into the water. As Skagran climbed through, Rick Lorneman saw Bryla had finally managed to light an oil lamp. She held it in the air and was about to throw it down when a volley of bolts smashed through the door's panels, two of them taking her in the gut and shoulder. She spun around and stumbled back, frantically looking over at him.
"You, go!"
she screamed above the noise.
"I'll hold them as long as I can."
Rick Lorneman backed out of the window, sending an arrow through the door as he heard Skagran splash into the water below him. There came a pained grunt, followed by a brief pause in the commotion, and Bryla dashed the oil lamp onto the floor. Flames hungrily ate at the spilled liquor, quickly spreading across the room. She drew her knife and clutched the bolt in her belly with the other hand as the door finally exploded inward, sending the table sliding back across the room. Rick Lorneman heard her defiant battle cry as he started down the rope, but already knew she was lost. The sound of clashing steel was muffled as he dropped the last few meters and was consumed by the icy sea. When he resurfaced, the only cries he heard were to fetch water and to put out the fires. Bryla was gone. He swam back towards the boat, a grim feeling churning in his gut that he had to leave two of his comrades behind. But he pushed the thought from his mind. They were not safe yet, and if none of them made it, their lives had been lost for nothing. When Rick Lorneman finally reached the cutter, the others were already on board and had started to row. He pulled himself over the side and fell flat on his back, gasping for air. Bolts sploshed in the waves about them and were quickly answered with arrows from the Rangers, every one of them finding their marks until none of the Vicious Moor's crew risked showing their heads to fire another bolt at the escaping vessel. They made the outer harbour wall in good time as soldiers started to appear on the fortified ramparts. They looked down at the small craft as its crew rowed through the entrance channel.
Fire!
Rick Lorneman called up to them.
There's fire on the Vicious Moor!
In the distance, there was a thin trail of grey smoke spiralling from the stern of the flagship into the air, captured perfectly by the setting sun. It was enough. The soldiers were adequately distracted to allow the cutter to pass through unhindered. By the time they had rowed into the inner harbour, there was a bustle of activity, as the dockyard warehouses, used as temporary barracks, spilled out its soldiers into the streets. Nobody knew what was really going on or what had happened. All they could see was the smoke on the darkening horizon and a heavy tension in the air. Now was not a good time to be a stranger in Telberg City. They needed a distraction. With perfect timing, an explosion ripped through the noise of the gathering soldiers, splitting an old wooden pier in two and throwing water and wood across the dockside. Men screamed as their bodies were struck by vicious splinters and thrown like ragdolls through the air. Rick Lorneman caught movement on a nearby rooftop and recognized Redis. The red-haired ranger drew his bow and fired. Rick Lorneman heard the gears whirring in the arrow as it flew over his head. "Take cover!" Rick Lorneman shouted to his team, diving to the ground as another explosion shook the ground nearby. This time an old wall erupted into the air, flinging stones in all directions, crushing people and collapsing buildings. Rick Lorneman and his rangers found their feet and ran through the confusion, making for the cobbled streets. A few shouts went up from dazed soldiers as they passed, but they were quickly silenced from well-placed arrows that flew in from the rooftops of the dockside buildings. As they entered the streets, the tall buildings closed in around them. Pressing on, Redis's squad joined them one by one, appearing from their hiding places and racing with them towards the eastern gates that led out into the forest. Every so often, a distant shout would catch Rick Lorneman's attention, but then it was gone, muffled by the noisy city, as it was stirred awake by the sound of destruction in the harbour. The eastern gate was open as they neared. Guards slumped near the portcullis, each one wearing red smiles, blood soaking their leather armour. Rick Lorneman and his rangers sprinted through and they were quickly joined by Sather.
"I take it as things went south?"
Sather breathed noisily as she caught up.
You could say that,
Rick Lorneman replied.
It's definitely time for us to get out of here.
She lifted a hand to her mouth and whistled. The remainder of her squad moved from the tree line, leading the tower griffins behind them. Rick Lorneman let out a shout and was answered by his own griffin's call as it circled above and dove from the sky to meet him. The great beast swooped down and landed with remarkable finesse considering its heavy stone body. Lifting its head, it gave up a forlorn shriek. Rick Lorneman stroked its neck feathers.
I know, Pallas. We are two fewer, but their loss will not go unpunished.
The griffin clawed at the ground before lowering its body for Rick Lorneman to climb on. He climbed into the saddle and gripped the beast's body with his legs.
Rangers,
he yelled.
We fly!
Wings beat all around as the griffins took to the air with their riders. They were far from the ground as the first ranks of soldiers emerged from the city gates. A few tried to reach them with their crossbows, but they either missed or the bolts broke upon the stone underbellies of the griffin.
With me!
Rick Lorneman shouted and pushed his griffin towards the harbour and Chaos Legion flotilla beyond. Cries of alarm went up as they passed over the devastation along Telberg's dockside. People pointing and shouting. The warning spread to the outer dock as soldiers scrambled to turn the ballistae on the towers at the approaching foe. The Rangers fired upon them, arrows cutting down the enemy until the few that remained decided retreat was the better part of valor. They darted out of sight and down the two towers' stairwells. The griffins flew on, and as Rick Lorneman neared the Vicious Moor, he drew a long arrow from the quiver attached to Pallas's saddle. Turning the small cogs near the arrow's tip, he double-checked the correct runes were in alignment before notching it to his bow. The tiny gears whirred, and the countdown began. Taking aim, Rick Lorneman sought out the small skiff that they had left moored alongside the Moor. Remembering where he had left his pack, he fired the arrow. The sound of gears hummed as it flew, finding its mark and thudding into the small boat's bow.
Rangers, climb!
Rick Lorneman commanded. Gripping Pallas's neck feathers, the Griffin began a steep climb into the dusky sky. The blast below was not as loud as the others had been, but it was just as devastating. The flagship's bell rang out the alarm, Rick Lorneman's charge having blown a hole the size of a wagon in the hull of the ship. He could see the water rush into the cargo hold as the ship rolled with the force of the explosion. It wouldn't be long before the vicious Moor was lying on the seabed. Rick Lorneman turned his Griffin west towards the setting sun and coast of Pretoria. Soon they would be in Dragon's Bay, and his rangers could rest. There they would light the fires and burn the wooden cape pins of the fallen rangers in their memory. He reached into the saddlebag and touched his own pin, feeling the raised wing and claw.
Live by the wing, die by the claw,
he whispered, feeling a sadness well up inside.
If you sail long enough, then the waters speak of a horror that strikes fear in every man. If you sail long enough, then you just might see a ship that makes you run as fast as you can. So beware on the high seas, beware on the low breeze. Before you know, she'll sneak up behind. When you see those jaws, you're out of time. The vicious maw is the end of the line for you.